Do you think that this war can be ended, all wars end diplomatically? At the end of the day, you have to sit down. You don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. Do you think that this war can be ended anytime soon in the diplomatic sphere, or is this got to be more fighting?
It's hard at the moment now to see an early diplomatic solution, in part, as I said earlier, because I think the Trump administration has mishandled its effort to mediate. Now, if the Trump administration embraced my proposals, applied more pressure, more leverage on Moscow, I'm not going to say that would guarantee a different Russian approach, but I think it would greatly increase the prospects that the Kremlin might alter its course and you might be able to get a just and durable settlement. But I think on the current course, the administration is not using the leverage it has with Moscow, and the Russians are not prepared to move. So I fear the war is going to continue.
Hello. This week on The Edge, we have a very timely guest. It is former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Steven Pifer. And he was here posted to Kyiv from 1998 to 2000. But throughout his storied career, he held a number of different positions and offices all around Europe, and in particular, the former Soviet Union. So he really knows his stuff. And now I say timely because this also comes in a week where we did see some very minor movement on the diplomatic stage, not as much as perhaps some folks would have originally hoped, but baby steps. That is a topic of discussion, but also we have a number of other topics that we discuss in kind of a bigger picture framework. Where there is a potential chance for some incremental change, and sadly, where things remain pretty unlikely to develop in any kind of positive way, and that means more fighting. Regardless, as I say, this is a chance to talk to somebody with a great deal of experience, and I am sure that you will find something in it new, interesting, and informative. So, Ambassador Steve Pifer, thank you very much for joining us at On the Edge. Obviously, there's a lot going on that we are recording on Thursday, the 15th of May, and who knows what will happen between now and when we publish on Sunday, because primarily we see what's happening in Istanbul and the potential of at least some sort of movement on the diplomatic front. What is your assessment of the diplomatic efforts to try and find a mediated peace?
Well, I think what we've seen over the last 5 or 6 days suggests that the Russians are still playing games and not really serious about a negotiated effort to end the war. So on Saturday, President Zelensky met with the leaders of France, Germany, Britain, and Poland, and they came out with a proposal for an immediate ceasefire to then be followed by negotiations, and also the threat that if there was no Russian agreement to a ceasefire, that there would be enhanced Western sanctions. And President Macron talked to President Trump on Saturday, and President Trump aligned himself with that position. Early Sunday, Vladimir Putin rejected the ceasefire and said, no, we have to have direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. President Trump then kind of flipped and endorsed direct negotiations, moving away from the position of a ceasefire first. But then President Zelensky said, okay, I'm prepared to meet with Putin on the 15th of May in Istanbul. And very quickly, the Russians begin backing away from Putin going to meet with Zelensky. It turned out we learned on the 14th that Foreign Minister Lavrov was not going. And so according to the press reporting, a Russian low-level delegation arrived with, they said they have a mandate to negotiate, but they have no real authority to make any decisions. And so I think the Ukrainians are meeting with that group, but my expectations that they'll achieve anything are just about zero. But what I would like to
Well,
see,
it's kind of the modus operandi of the Russians to do this kind of stuff. I've seen it. I've been
yeah,
covering the region for almost 30 years now. It's
yeah,
kind of what they do.
yeah, no, exactly. And I would hope that at some point the Trump administration recognizes that they are being gamed, that they're being played, and moves to take some more serious steps. What you've seen over the last 3 months, I believe, is a series of American concessions and carrots offered to Moscow, for which the United States has received nothing in return. There's been these carrots have not generated any Russian movement to, try to find a compromise, any movement towards a just and durable settlement to the war. And so it's actually long past time for the United States to provide some sticks. And President Trump has substantial leverage that he could use to press Moscow were he to choose to use it. So far, he's chosen not to do so. That's a mistake.
Yeah, I'm going to jump to a different question because that leads me right into it. Is why do you think it is that the Trump administration seems to have this preferential stance towards Vladimir Putin's Russia and seems to be, and in some ways quite publicly, demonstrably against Ukraine and Zelensky, or at least, they don't. They seem to appreciate the Kremlin more than they do Zelensky. I don't know why that is. Do you?
I wish I fully understood it myself. I mean, I think we have seen that traditionally over the last 10 years, Trump, like strongmen, he admires Putin. I think he looks at he's a strong guy. I think Zelensky labors under a Trump perception. Remember, Trump's first impeachment resulted from Trump's effort to extort Zelensky. Zelensky did not cave into that. But I think in some sense, maybe Trump holds Zelensky responsible for that impeachment. There's only one geopolitical theory that I've heard that makes sense for what the administration is trying to do. And it's been hinted at a couple of times by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And this is this idea that if the United States now throws Ukraine under the bus, cuts support to Ukraine, cuts Ukraine loose, and then takes a big step back away from Europe, that somehow Trump can cultivate a relationship with Putin and pry Putin away from the Chinese and Chinese President Xi. If that's the case, it is based on a badly flawed misunderstanding of Russia's dependency on China and a badly flawed misunderstanding of the relationship between Putin and Xi. Putin is not going to throw Xi over to place a bet on Donald Trump, who is A, unpredictable, and B, is going to be out of office in 3.5 years. So if that's the grand strategy, it's going to fail. It will leave the United States a couple years down the road facing a Russia-China tandem, and we'll have, I think, many fewer friends and allies that are prepared to work with us.
I think you're absolutely right. And in addition to that, I would add, again, having studied the region, lived in the region, and all the rest of it, is that this would be throwing aside, a long-standing animosity between Moscow and the West, and in particular the Anglo-American alliance. They really see us as their primary enemy or competitor on the global stage. So to think that suddenly they would transition from China to this new world where they have a friendly relationship with America, who they openly loathe, I think is not true, is not realistic. And that leads me to my other question, because you mentioned Secretary of State Rubio, and he's one of the few people on the diplomatic stage from the United States that seems to have any real chops in this. And even then, he's never lived in the region. He doesn't speak the language. You've got Keith Kellogg, who has a long-standing connection kind of because of his military experience. But aside from that, we get guys like, Steve Witkoff, who's a property developer. What has happened, Mr. Ambassador? What has happened to our Russia bench? Where are the Fiona Hills?
Yeah.
Where are the Maria Ivanoviches? It's been swept, it seems to me.
No, I actually think if you look down at the State Department at the level of the Russia desk, if you looked at the intelligence community, you're going to find a lot of expertise on Russia. But thus far, the Trump administration has chosen not to use it. So when Mr. Witkoff goes to Moscow, by all appearances, there's nobody with him. Does he have Russian expertise with him? I don't think so. Does he meet with the embassy before he goes and sees Putin? I don't think so. It looks like the interpreter that he uses is not provided by the American side, it's provided by the Russians. And so I think Mr. Witkoff gets caught up in this kind of this gaga moment because he's meeting with Putin. Putin plays him, and it's pretty clear that Witkoff really doesn't understand the region. So go back to that Tucker Carlson interview when Witkoff came back and said, well, that those areas occupied by the Russians, really, they're pro-Russian on the basis of the referenda that the Russians conducted in September of 2022, and because they speak Russian. I spent 3 years in Ukraine. There are a lot of Ukrainians, including ethnic Ukrainians, who use Russian as their first language. One is this guy named Volodymyr Zelensky, who happens to be the president of Ukraine. The fact that you speak Russian does not mean that you want to be a Russian or part of Russia. Moreover, the referenda that were conducted back in September 22 were just bogus. Nobody took them seriously. I mean, there's video you can find online of mobile ballot boxes going to apartments, going door to door to get people to vote on a referendum saying, do you want to join Russia? And these guys are accompanied by people with heavy machine guns. My guess is, people knew how they were supposed to vote in that. And to give any credibility to that suggests that Mr. Witkoff really doesn't have the understanding to engage in the negotiation he's trying to engage in. I think General Kellogg, has taken time. Kellogg actually has a staff, including people from the State Department, so he has access to that expertise. But it looks like between Witkoff and Kellogg, Trump gives more attention to Witkoff. And then Secretary Rubio, I agree with your opening comment. I mean, as senator, he spent, 12 years on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So this is somebody I think who understands. And if you look back at how he's talked about Russia as senator, how he's talked about the Russian-Ukraine war as senator, I think he has a very good understanding. Quite frankly, I was hoping that, he would be one of the adults in the room. But unfortunately, 4 months into the administration, he seems to be, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure how strong his voice is in the inner councils because he seems to be really trimming his sails so that he doesn't get crosswise with Trump. If, in fact, what you have in the inner circle around Trump are a bunch of yes people, it's going to result in flawed policy, and that's of concern.
Without, and I always have to tread carefully when I talk about topics of this nature, but it's unavoidable in some aspect. Do you think this has been purposeful, that they have kind of gotten all the people with years, decades of experience living in the region, speaking the language, getting to know the players, whether it's Peskov or Zakharova or Lavrov or what have you? I mean, Lavrov and Kerry, I attended the Iran talks in Geneva. They got along quite well, actually. But it seems on the American side that the Trump administration has repeatedly kind of eliminated expertise when it comes to leadership in Russian kind of diplomacy. Why do you think that has been, and how concerned are you that there aren't any experts in the room?
Well, again, I think if the administration chose, it has that expertise. I mean, you've got people on the Russia desk at State. You've got people serving in other embassies who spent time in Moscow. You've got people in the intelligence community, analysts of the CIA and other places that have spent years, if not decades, working on Russia. The question is, does the senior leadership, does the president, does the Secretary of State, does the National Security Advisor, of course now the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State are one and the same, do they choose to draw on that expertise? And again, we have a lot of reporting from Mr. Trump's first term in office that he doesn't like to take briefings, that he really goes with his bet. So I think the expertise is there. There are people in the government who are very smart about Russia, who understand what the Russians are trying to do. But, if nobody asks them the question and no one listens to them, that expertise is not useful.
Sadly, yes,
Yeah.
I would agree with you there. Of course, one of the other consequences of if the Russians run rings around them and if they can't seem to make any success, they the team that's been assembled to deal with diplomacy has indicated that they would walk away. They just walk away. This is nobody's willing to play nice. We can't make any headway. We're walking away. What would the consequences be if the U.S. just said, too difficult, we're walking away?
Well, I mean, let's be clear. That would be a failure of Mr. Trump's, one of his big first initiatives. He talked about he could end the war in 24 hours. That suggested he didn't understand how complex the war was. But in February, he began to sort of roll out this strategy. Now, I would argue that, he's rolled out a strategy that is going to fail because he has not used the leverage that he has. The string of carrots, concessions, and gifts to Russia have not generated any Russian movement on terms of issues of interest to the United States. They've not generated any Russian movement in terms of a more accommodating position in trying to find a just and durable settlement to the war. But the president also has sticks. He could ask Congress for $30 billion for more military assistance to Ukraine. He could launch an effort working with the Europeans and other allies to close the sanction loopholes that have made the sanctions that have been applied over the last few years less effective than they could and should have been. He could ask the G7 and the Europeans to work with the United States to seize the frozen Russian central bank assets and convert that into a fund for Ukraine. I mean, $300 billion, that would keep Ukraine going and meet its military needs and the needs of keeping the government going for 5 or 6 years. All of those steps would signal to the Kremlin that if you do not negotiate seriously to find a real end to this war, and you continue fighting, the cost in military terms, economic terms, political terms are going to be high, and they are going to escalate. And that would, I hope, give the Kremlin an incentive to consider a change in course. But Trump has done none of that. And by virtue of that, I think he's basically set his mediation effort on a course to fail.
Yeah, we find common ground there. I see the same concerns. But let me ask you this. When it comes to the participants in the actual fighting, so the Ukrainian side and the Russian side, where do you see red lines that are intangible, that either Kyiv or Moscow is just never going to accept? And where do you think there's room for either the Europeans or the Americans to bring common ground?
Yeah. Well, I think the Ukrainian position, I believe, has evolved in a pretty significant way. So if you go back 2 years ago, the Ukrainian position was Russia has to withdraw from all Ukrainian territory. What President Zelensky is now prepared to do is accept a ceasefire in place, which means at least for some temporary period, he's prepared to accept Russian occupation of about 19% of Ukraine. And he's also said he's prepared to agree that Ukraine would not use military force to try to recover that territory. I think that's a pretty major concession. But he's also tied it to the question of security guarantees, is that if he's going to make that kind of concession, he wants a solid security guarantee so that Russia doesn't use 2 or 3 years of time to regenerate forces and then launch a new attack to grab more Ukrainian territory. And I think that's a very reasonable position. Now, ideally, in his view, that would be NATO membership. I think NATO membership would be the strongest guarantee to provide for Ukraine, but that requires a consensus among NATO members. But are there other things? Could you have a coalition of willing countries who could put a reassurance force on the ground in Ukraine? Could you reach an agreement where the West would basically provide Ukraine with the weapons it needs to maintain a standing military of maybe 600,000 or 700,000 people that had the ability not only to defend Ukraine, but also, if the Russians launch a new attack, to conduct offensive strikes into Russia? the so-called porcupine model. So that, to my mind, is one of the basic issues here. Is if the Ukrainians have to accept, even temporarily, some loss of territory, can they have a security guarantee that means this war is not going to have a phase two at the time that Moscow might choose in 2 or 3 years? Now, the Ukrainians have articulated, and I was actually in Kyiv last week, and I heard the Ukrainians, really repeat sort of 3 key red lines. One is, while they may be prepared to accept the de facto occupation of Ukrainian territory by the Russians, they adamantly oppose de jure recognition of that occupation. They're not prepared to concede that is formally Russian territory. And they ask, understandably, that Ukraine's partners and allies also refuse to do that. Second, they said they will accept no limits on their military. That's understandable. The Russian proposal for demilitarization would leave Ukraine with 85,000 troops under arms, while Russia is now at about 1.3 million and building to 1.5 million. Now, that would just leave Ukraine open to a further Russian attack. And then they've also said that they would not accept any limitations on their ability to choose their foreign policy course, including alliances. And that's actually a right which in the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, Moscow recognized that countries have the right to choose their own associations and alliances. So that's, I think, the package of limitations that the Ukrainians have specified. They strike me as very reasonable. Now, the Russians have a position which, if anything, has gotten harder over the last 3 years. They've added additional demands. And the Russian demands, and I think Putin is prepared to negotiate on the basis of his terms, but his terms would amount to the complete capitulation of Ukraine. So it should be no surprise if the Ukrainians say no, thank you.
Yeah, I don't see any room where the Russians are willing to give concessions. They're really still filled with demands and red lines. So, it brings me back to this question of how Moscow sees Kyiv. And you were ambassador here in a very, very different time.
Yeah.
In the post-Soviet era. I was living in Moscow as a journalist working for CBS News when you were ambassador here in Kyiv. And I remember when I started to travel here that it was almost seen as a satellite state or a puppet state. Do you think that Moscow can ever accept a sovereign Ukraine?
I think Boris Yeltsin was prepared to accept that. Vladimir Putin brings a very different approach. You go back, 4 years ago, the essay that Putin published. Putin fundamentally does not accept the right of Ukraine to exist as a sovereign and independent state. He doesn't see Ukrainians as a different nationality. They're just wayward Russians. The Ukrainians obviously have a much stronger or very different view. And I think it's been made pretty clear that Ukrainians want to chart their own course. It was interesting, when I served in Kyiv back at the end of the 1990s, first of all, while the relations between Moscow and Kyiv had problems, Moscow had agreed 3 or 4 times in the course of the 1990s to accept and recognize Ukraine as a sovereign independent state within the borders that Ukraine had when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. That was in the Budapest Memorandum. It was in the big bilateral treaty between Moscow and Ukraine in 1997. It was in other international commitments that the Russians made. Vladimir Putin just threw all of that over. And again, I think there was really a change with Putin that I think what we're now seeing as that Putin really has this neo-imperialist streak, where what he's trying to do is recover parts of the Russian Empire that were lost in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. This is really
which he calls the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century.
Right. I think most historians would disagree with that.
Yes. We have had the great pleasure of speaking with Volodymyr Yelchenko on our program here at On the Edge in Kyiv, who was the last Ukrainian ambassador to Moscow before the 2014 annexation. His position is that, now call it Russia Empire, call it Vladimir Putin, whatever you like, but his, sadly, as a diplomat, and perhaps you'll share the sentiment, he was saddened to have to make the admission that this probably was, this war was unavoidable, which is very different than what Trump says repeatedly. This war would never have happened had I been president. Given the history of the two nations, given the complexities, do you side with Ambassador Yelchenko saying this was always going to come to a head with conflict, or do you think this could have been avoided?
One of the interesting things to me, and one of the ironies, go back to 2013. In 2013, you had Viktor Yanukovych as president. People called him pro-Russian. I actually think Yanukovych was pro-Yanukovych, but it led him to adopt policies that generally were favorable towards Russia. But in 2013, Yanukovych didn't want to bring Ukraine into NATO. He didn't, want a membership action plan. Polls showed that, NATO was not a high priority for most Ukrainians. But Yanukovych and the Ukrainian people, though, did want to bring Ukraine closer to the European Union. And so you had this negotiation of an association agreement. In 2013, that agreement was ready for signature. And literally, 8 or 9 days before Yanukovych was supposed to sign it, under pressure from the Russians, Yanukovych says, I'm not going to sign this. That began the Maidan Revolution. So if you look at all those events, it was really started by the Russian decision to pressure the Ukrainian president not to sign an association agreement with the European Union. And then with Russia's seizure of Crimea, just look at the polls. Ukrainian interest in NATO just goes higher, 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 and higher. And so I think there were really probably three reasons why in 2022 the Kremlin launched an all-out invasion of Ukraine. One was concern in the Kremlin that Ukraine was moving perhaps irretrievably out of Moscow's orbit towards the West. I think it was more in focus at that point on Ukraine's relationship with the European Union. Now, the irony here is, nothing has done more than Russian policy of the last 12 or 15 years to push Ukraine away from Russia and towards the West. The second factor was concern in the Kremlin that a stable, independent, democratic, successful Ukraine, that was a nightmare for the Kremlin, because that's the kind of Ukraine that causes the Russian people to say, why can't we have the same political voice, the same democratic rights that Ukrainians have? And for the Kremlin, job number one is regime preservation. But the third factor, and I think by far the biggest factor, is Vladimir Putin, who has a distorted view of history, and again, I think is embarked on a neo-imperialist course to regain parts of the Russian Empire that were lost. And he actually pretty much, he said this. If you go back to June of 2022, so about 4 months after the invasion, Putin was in St. Petersburg meeting with a group of business students. I think this was on the marches of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. And one of the students says, well, Peter the Great conquered the Baltic states. And Putin says, no. Peter the Great didn't conquer the Baltic states. Peter the Great recovered historic Russian territory. And then Putin went on to compare himself to Peter the Great. What we're doing in Ukraine is recovering historic Russian territory. So again, that's a neo-imperialist course. And that's actually why I think the concern about what Russia's doing and Putin's ambitions, I think it's more than Ukraine. If you look at a map of the Russian Empire at the end of the 18th century, well, it's not only most of modern-day Ukraine, it's a good part of Poland, the Baltic states, Finland were all part of the Russian Empire. Would Putin attack a NATO country? I think if you ask most experts now, they'd say, no, that would be crazy. And they're probably right, but I'd put a qualifier on that. If you'd asked the experts back in 2018 or 2019, would Putin launch the kind of military invasion of Russia that he did in 2022? They would have said, no, that would be crazy. It's a risk to underestimate Mr. Putin's ambitions, particularly when there's somebody here who's demonstrated, as I think we now see in 2022, he is capable of gross miscalculations.
Well, and he does seem to act out of a sense of grievance and a sense, he repeatedly says that Russia has no borders in the sense that it is its destiny to keep expanding. I have oftentimes said, and I'd like to get your response to this, whether you see any agreement with it. Despite all the protestations of those who say that Russia was provoked into this war because NATO kept expanding eastward, my response to that is no. As soon as they could get away from living under the thumb of Moscow, the East went fleeing west to the protection of NATO. I wonder what your response is to both the criticism that we expanded NATO and my assessment that it was rather the countries that had lived under Moscow that went fleeing west.
Yeah, I actually think historically, I don't think that case holds any water. I mean, I worked in the Clinton White House back in the mid-1990s.
Which the expansion of NATO east or the Western or the Eastern nations running away from Moscow?
No, the Russian case that this is all about NATO expanding as a threat to Russia. President Clinton, he wanted to enlarge NATO, but he also wanted to build a cooperative long-term relationship with Russia. So in parallel with our efforts to enlarge NATO, we also set about to try to build a NATO-Russia relationship and a NATO-Ukraine relationship. If you go back to the 1997 Founding Act that established the relationship between NATO and Russia, it had a couple important things in there. One, it said on the military side, because NATO was trying to make enlargement as painless as possible for Russia, it said there's no intention, no plan, no reason to place nuclear weapons on the territory of countries that enter NATO after 1997. And it also said there is no requirement for the permanent stationing of substantial combat forces on the territory of new members. And go back and look until 2014, there were no deployments of any NATO combat forces on the territory of new members, except for exercises, and they would go home after a week. It changed in 2014 after Russia seized Crimea, and then NATO began, I think, in 2015, deploying small multinational battalions, about 1,000 to 1,500 troops in Poland and the 3 Baltic states as a reassurance force. But that was a direct response to Russia's decision to use military force against Ukraine. Go back to 2002. Putin in 2002 meets with NATO leaders in Rome and agrees to reinvigorate the NATO-Russia relationship to give it a deeper quality, new meaning. And he doesn't say a thing about enlargement, even though we had to know that 6 months later in Prague, NATO leaders were going to meet again, and they were going to invite additional countries to join the alliance, quite probably including the Baltic states. That wasn't a problem for him. Also in 2002, when he met with Kuchma, he says, the relationship between NATO and Ukraine, that's up for Kuchma to decide. That's none of our business. So you had this position, and I think at the base, Putin does not fear a NATO attack. And the evidence I would offer is that in the last 2 and 3 years, the Finns and the Norwegians, 2 members of NATO, report that along their border, the Russian military has reduced its presence by 80%. And that's along a border, Kola Peninsula. It's pretty valuable military real estate. Putin does not fear a NATO attack, but he doesn't like NATO because he sees NATO as a constraint on his ambition to restore Russian influence and even physical control in the post-Soviet space and in Eastern Europe. But, again, there's just this idea, and if you go back to 2021, there was at that point no real enthusiasm within NATO to put Ukraine on a membership track. There was a cooperative relationship, but people weren't saying we should bring Ukraine in. And part of that, I think, was some NATO members were inclined to say, okay, that's a difficult issue for the Russians. And I think Putin understood that. He didn't, then he really ought to be questioning the capabilities of his intelligence community and his diplomats. Ironically, I think actually what you've seen in the last 3 years is support within NATO for bringing Ukraine into the alliance has grown. in part because there's a recognition that if you want to have a stable and secure Europe, you're going to have a hard time doing that if you don't have a stable and secure Ukraine. But again, that's been something that's resulted from Putin's aggression, not the other way around as he tries to portray it.
And another thing that I try to impress upon my audience oftentimes is that talk of an expansionist Russia that is successful in suppressing Ukraine, however that turns out. The idea that there would be Russian paratroopers in Gdansk, or tanks rolling down the Champs-Élysées, or Russian warships taking port in Liverpool. Yeah. It's not about an actual military presence that a resurgent Russia would be problematic. It's the threat and the exertion of power onto Western Europe, maybe not militarily, but constantly with the threat of. How much pause for concern do you have about the stability of Europe if Moscow is the whatever success means for Russia? Yeah. What does that mean for Europe?
Yeah, I think if Russia prevails in Ukraine, if it either wins on the battlefield or if it wins as a result of a shoddy deal, I think the Russian threat with an emboldened Vladimir Putin to Europe is going to be greater, and that threat to American interests is going to be greater. Now, one of the things, though, I think is a little bit heartening, though, is Europe seems, perhaps more than the Trump administration, to, I think, now correctly understand that there is a real threat in Russia. And that is, as much as we would like to sort of think, the Cold War's over, we could live in a reasonably stable relationship, there has to be more attention to sort of traditional defense. So if you go back to 2014, after the Russians seized Crimea, NATO leaders agreed that they would set a target by 2024 of each country dedicating about 2% of its gross domestic product to defense. And in 2024, last year, probably 3/4 of NATO allies met that standard. Well, the alliance will have another summit in June, and the talk now is that target needs to be raised to 3 to 3.5%. And you're seeing, I think in the Baltic states, they're all aiming for 4 to 5%. Poland's close to 5%. The Germans, who always had kind of this, because of the constitutional restrictions, had limits on how much that they could go into deficit in their budget, basically have said, okay, they've passed a law now that says defense spending above 1% of gross domestic product won't be counted. So I think you're now seeing more serious moves by Europe to increase their defenses, and that's a direct result of concerns about Russia. What I think, though, also is that what Ukraine is doing is Ukraine, of course, is defending itself, and that's first and foremost the Ukrainian objective, but they're also providing time for Europe to build up its military strength so that it can resist Russia, even if, for example, the Trump administration decides to pull back somewhat from Europe. And I also hope that there's a recognition there that if you look at countries other than Russia, who has the largest, most experienced military in Europe, and it's Ukraine. And that seems to me that
by leaps and bounds, yes.
That combination. I think from Europe's point of view, keeping that military as part of Europe is an important thing. And it's actually a good step for European defense, which is why I believe you're now seeing European countries be more supportive of Ukraine. This, by the way, is something I would not have predicted back in 2022. I know when initial steps were taken to support Ukraine, one of the questions that my colleagues at Stanford were talking about were, how long will Europe be prepared to do this? I would not have predicted in February of 2022 that in May of 2025, it would be clear that Europe is committed to helping Ukraine, and the real doubts are about the American commitment to continue supporting Ukraine is there.
This is obviously something, This is obviously something, pardon me, that I was very, looking forward to discussing with you is what does it mean for NATO if the overt statements that have been coming out of the Trump administration about an intended withdrawal from Europe, from NATO. What does this mean for NATO, and what does it mean for American alliance?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the good news is that, that withdrawal hasn't happened yet, and that there are other voices in the administration say that the United States remains committed. Although I still have a question in my mind about, President Trump's commitment to NATO. I'm not sure I have a lot of confidence that will continue. Hopefully it will, because I think actually for the United States, having that transatlantic security organization, that's in the American interest. I mean, allies are useful. And I spent 3 years working on the NATO desk at the State Department. Allies can be difficult to deal with. But I think it was General Mattis who said that the only thing worse than going to war without allies is the only thing worse than going to war with allies is going to war without allies. Allies, they give us access. I mean, the United States had, a huge drawdown from 300,000 military personnel in Europe at the end of the Cold War to about 70 to 80,000. But most of those, a large portion of those forces in Europe over the last 20 years weren't in Europe. They were supporting American military operations in the Middle East and Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. Allies provide troops, so both Gulf Wars, there were allies alongside the United States fighting. It was not just an American operation. Allies provide legitimacy. If we have allies supporting us, it's not just the American cowboy doing something. And I don't think Mr. Trump understands any of this. And he talks about it's all about defense. And I agree with him that allies need to do more for their own defense. But you take Afghanistan. We lost 2,400 Americans in 20 years of fighting in Afghanistan. What doesn't get a lot of attention in the United States is 1,000 soldiers from NATO countries died alongside those 2,400 Americans. And they were only there. They were only there because they were allies. So in the future, if we want to have those kinds of allies supporting us, we need to nurture this relationship. And I worry that that's not where the Trump administration is. And I think in Europe, there's a recognition of this. So I think Europe is wisely working to try to keep the United States linked to NATO. But you now have, I think, in capitals like Paris and Berlin and Warsaw and London, people thinking, well, what happens if the American commitment really is going away? Now, economically, Europe has 3 or 4 times the population of Russia. It has an economy collectively 8 times the size of Russia. The Europeans can do this. They've got to do it. I think that they need to spin up, they need some time to spin things up. But again, I think transatlantic security would be stronger both for Europe and for the United States if we maintain, what's been the most successful alliance in world history. And it's had a pretty good run for 76 years.
Yeah, and I'm not going to keep you for very much longer, but I do have a handful more questions, and one of them is leading directly off what you just mentioned. It isn't just our alliances in London, Berlin, Paris, but it's also Seoul and Tokyo and, Taipei. What will it mean for America's other alliances if we set a precedent by saying, you know what, this NATO stuff, that's your problem, Europe. We've had 76 years of alliance, but we're sick of it. What does that mean for our reputation globally?
And hard to think of something that would be less welcome in places like China. Part of this is, I think demonstrating America's commitment to support Ukraine, that's an important message also for China. The ability of the United States, for example, to mobilize a large amount of support for Ukraine has to figure into whatever calculation President Xi might be making. And he says he wants by 2027 to have the ability, if he chooses, to take Taiwan by military force. Well, if the United States says after 3 years, when we haven't lost a single American soldier in Ukraine, we say, this is too hard, we're leaving. What's the message that we send to China? I don't think it's a good one.
I don't either. And if I were Beijing, I would be paying very, very close attention. So, can I bring this back for the last couple of questions here, back to Ukraine itself? Do you think that this war can be ended? All wars end diplomatically. At the end of the day, you have to sit down. You don't make
Yeah,
peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies.
right.
Do you think that this war can be ended anytime soon in the diplomatic sphere, or is this got to be more fighting?
I, yeah, it's hard at the moment now to see an early diplomatic solution, in part, as I said earlier, because I think the Trump administration has mishandled its effort to mediate. Now, if the Trump administration embraced my proposals, applied more pressure, more leverage on Moscow, I'm not going to say that would guarantee a different Russian approach, but I think it would greatly increase the prospects that the Kremlin might alter its course and you might be able to get a just and durable settlement. But I think on the current course, the administration is not using the leverage it has with Moscow, and the Russians are not prepared to move. So I fear the war is going to continue. And
Aside from those sanctions that you mentioned, what other you've often said in our discussion here, the carrot and stick approach.
yeah,
What can we do when it comes to Russia, who does seem to be the one intent on continuing military efforts here? What would your recommendations be to the Trump administration, aside from what you just mentioned, to try and crack down on and force them to the table, perhaps?
well, I first of all, I think when we saw this, when you had the British, French, German, and Polish leaders in Kyiv on last Saturday, there's a basis for, I think, a very strong American-European effort to put more pressure on Russia. So on sanctions, it's still pretty clear Western high tech is getting into Russia. There's got to be ways that we can close that down. Can we reduce energy revenues to Russia? So there's this idea that's been going on, I think it's had some success, that if you want to legally, or if you want to buy Russian oil and you want to use either a Western flagged tanker, a lot of those tankers are flagged in Western countries, or if you want Western insurance, and I think like 90% of the insurance is provided by the British and other, you have to show that oil was bought at $60 per barrel. Push that price down. I mean, the Russians can probably raise that oil for $15 or $20 a barrel. They're desperate for money. They're still going to put that oil on the world market. So you're still going to have the Russian oil there to keep the global price of oil down, but push the price down so you reduce revenues to Russia. I think that can be done. As I said, the president could ask Congress, I want $30 billion for military assistance to Ukraine. It goes against all of his instincts. But again, while Ukraine has made huge progress, Ukraine was hardly building more than 5 or 10% of their weapons back in 2022. They're now producing 35 to 40% of what they need. But they still need from American air defense and certain types of niche American capabilities. Make it clear we're going to provide that, along with the Europeans continuing to provide Ukraine with military assistance, so that the Ukrainian military, it's very clear to the Russians that the Ukrainian military will have the wherewithal, it'll have the arms, the ammunition, the weapons to continue the fight. And then, as I said, seize the Russian central bank assets. That is a pool then of $300 billion. And so, even if, Trump doesn't want to keep providing assistance all the time, he could sell stuff. So there are lots
and we all know he's transactional, so yeah.
Yeah, no, my guess is at the end of the day, it's hard for me to see him asking Congress for more money for assistance to Ukraine, although I think that would actually be something in the American interest. But if he doesn't do that, I think he'd be prepared to sell things. So you could do things, and then you change the Russian calculation. I think right now the Russian calculation is probably assuming that there will be no further American assistance for Ukraine. And at that point, does that begin to exhaust Ukraine's air defense capabilities, particularly against ballistic missile attacks? So is the Russian expectation that things will become easier for them on the battlefield? We shouldn't want that to happen. And so I think there's a lot that could be done. And again, at the end of the day, it might not change the Kremlin's course, but at least it would raise for the Kremlin the costs of continuing this war. And those costs are substantial. I think the British Ministry of Defense now says 900,000 Russian soldiers killed or wounded in action. You know, the Ukrainians, while they are outmanned in terms of, this is a larger Russian population, the Ukrainians do have the advantage of they're fighting largely on the defensive now. So they're fighting from defensive positions. And the defender usually has advantages. And I think those advantages have been shown up in terms of, continuing high casualties by the Russians who, managed to capture a little bit of Ukrainian territory here and there, but they pay enormous costs for those gains. And at some point, I have to think, the Russians have to ask themselves, is this level of loss worth it?
Yep.
But
well, and we'll wrap this up before I do. I mean, Putin, in my mind, also has another problem, and that has existed throughout Russian history, starting with like the Decembrists. When a large armed force returns home, oftentimes after a Pyrrhic victory or a loss, it doesn't end well for the Tsar or for whoever's in power in the Kremlin. So I think he's got that on his mind. And so now I'm gonna ask you my last question. And again, I am extremely grateful for your time, and thank you so much for speaking to my audience, because this is the whole intent of what we're doing here at this studio, is to try and keep Ukraine on people's minds and to have discussions that maybe in topics that they hadn't talked about before. So here's the last question, and it's the question every single guest absolutely hates to be asked, because no one has a crystal ball. But if you were to have a crystal ball, where does this go? Best case scenario, worst case scenario, this conflict? Yeah, you hate that question. I know. Everybody does. I hate it when people ask me.
I think regardless whether at the end of the day, I'm very confident that there's going to be a sovereign, independent Ukrainian state on the map of Europe. And the territory that it controls is going to be much larger than the rump state the Russians intended to leave behind when they launched the invasion in 2022. I mean, I think the Ukrainians have just shown, their readiness to defend that. That maybe that's a situation after, unfortunately, it might be months more or years more of fighting. But I don't think Ukraine disappears. I don't think the Russians have shown that they do not have the capability to capture all of Ukraine, or to capture maybe even much more of Ukraine. The best case scenario, to my mind, would be, again, the Trump administration realizing that it's been played for 3 months by Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin, adopting a different course. That at some point you would just wonder. I mean, in a way, I think it's almost kind of a humiliation for the American president. Does he realize that he is being played like this, and then does he snap back and say, well, then I'm going to do what I would consider the right thing and continue to support Ukraine? And again, if there's the right combination of continued Ukrainian resilience, supported by the West, supported by continued weapons support for Ukraine, and supported by increased sanctions, increased pressure on the Russians, the best case would be that at some point, the Kremlin concludes this war is just not worth it. Let's adopt a more reasonable approach, and then maybe you could work out some kind of a settlement.
And worst case scenario?
No, the worst case scenario is the war continues on for some time to come. But as I said, I think at the end of the day, Ukraine might lose a bit more territory, but I think there still is a sovereign, independent Ukrainian state on the map of Europe. I think
which includes Kyiv and which includes Odessa and therefore the Black Sea. I agree with you.
It includes more than that.
Much more than that. Hopefully, But for Russia's strategic aims to be met at the cost of over 1 million casualties, to not regain dominion of the Black Sea. And, Sevastopol will never be safe as long as Odessa is Ukraine. So
and my understanding right now is that Russians are continuing to lose casualties at the rate that they were losing in 20 or 1,500 a day. And roughly a third of those, killed in action. That's 15,000, Russian soldiers killed in action a month. Now, at some point, they've got to say, is this really worth it for grinding out and capturing a few more square kilometers of Ukrainian territory? I would like to see the Russians come to that conclusion sooner rather than later. And again, if there's the right Western approach and the right American approach, we can help Moscow come to that conclusion sooner than later.
Well, you've been very gracious with your time, and it's deeply appreciated. And I'm going to be a bit greedy. If there's anything else you'd like, my audience obviously cares about Ukraine. Otherwise, they wouldn't be watching our programs. Is there anything you'd like to say to my audience before something that maybe you think it's important to understand about Ukraine, about the conflict, about Russia? Is there something you'd like to convey?
Let me just go, Slava Ukraini.
Geroyam Slava, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.